Are we?
Yep, we're live.
Okay, so I'd like to thank everyone for joining me and the Revolutionary Students Union for this presentation on Gene Sharp, the New Face of American Imperialism. I'm going to lead off with a little bit of a disclaimer. So I'm giving this lecture, which is my personal view. You may notice I'm wearing a Freedom Red Socialist Organization shirt, which is an organization I'm part of. This does not represent their views. So I'm not speaking as a representative of the Freedom Red Socialist Organization. I am not speaking as a representative of the Revolutionary Students Union. I'm speaking primarily as myself. That's what I'm doing. So just in case you were wondering, again, I don't represent any organization in this presentation, but I think it's very important. It's a very important presentation to kind of understand and make sense of a lot of the things that are going on in the world. So that being said, if you have any questions, or if anyone out there in internet land is a student or is near a campus and wants to start a Revolutionary Students Union, feel free to contact me. You can get to contact me through Facebook or through the Revolutionary Students Union website, but Facebook's probably the easiest. My name is Gregory Lucero, and I'm very easy to find. So, with those two things said, what are we talking about? Who is Gene Sharp? Why should we care? And how is Gene Sharp related to American imperialism? So this is a basic outline of my lecture. I was trying to get a complete PowerPoint finished, but I just got out of class and I didn't have time to finish it. So some of this is a little off the cuff, where a lot of it is much more researched. And hopefully it'll be unclear to you which is off the cuff and which is well researched, but I'll certainly try my best to clarify things. At any given point, if you have any questions, if you need any clarifications, if you need any background, whether at home or here on the Salt Lake City Community College campus, please raise your hand. I want this to be as interactive as you want it, and I want to be as clear as possible. So if you have any questions, ask them, because if you have a question, undoubtedly people at home have a question. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is Gene Sharp's book / pamphlet, which is Democracy. It's actually From Dictatorship to Democracy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about his book, I'm going to talk a little bit about his background, and I'm going to talk a little bit about, that'll sort of frame the discussion of as we move forward. I'm also going to make a very startling hypothesis, and I'm not necessarily saying it's 100% correct, but I do think this is the case, and we can certainly debate it. I'm open to questions, but the traditional form of American imperialism that lasted from the end of World War II has actually ended. And I'll be very precise about what I mean. And I'll talk a little bit about imperialism, and I'll talk a little bit about its structure, but mainly I'm talking about the tactics of imperialism. So I will actually go into the political economy of it. But my thesis is the last American war in the old style of imperialism was actually the Iraq War, and the last coup in the old style of American imperialism was the attempted coup against Chavez in the early 2000s, and it was highly unsuccessful. Both of those ventures were highly unsuccessful, and I'll kind of go through why they were unsuccessful, the political economy behind that, and how U.S. imperialism is adapting to these new conditions. So I'll cover that. I'll also talk about very briefly, the first run of American imperialism using Gene Sharp as its basis. This will be the color revolutions in the mid to late 2000s, and then I'll talk about their failures, and then I'll move into what I believe is the current tactic of imperialism. And the current tactics of imperialism is Gene Sharp 2.0, which hopefully somebody gets the reference, which is Gene Sharp Armed. And I'll go into that and talk in detail about that. And in fact, we are seeing Gene Sharp 2.0 in Venezuela, in Ukraine, but also we've seen it in Syria and Libya as somewhat successful cases of this new tactic, to be very precise, this new tactic of imperialism. And then I'm going to talk about the tactics and why that is the case in more detail. So, let's get started. Who is Gene Sharp? Gene Sharp is founded the Albert Einstein Institute, which based around nonviolence. Now, this may sound odd that someone who has spent his entire life studying nonviolence, he's actually written books on what he calls civilian nonviolent self-defense. He advocates for abolishing the military, abolishing armed struggle as a form of self-defense of nations to defend themselves, and in fact to spend money on civilian self-defense. Certain things like building bunkers, building supply routes outside of cities, so that in the case of an invasion, the population can withdraw, non-cooperate, and coerce the invaders to be unable to carry out their actions, right? Because people don't invade just to invade, they invade because they want resources or power or territory. And so he has an entire theory of nonviolence, nonviolent political defiance on how to defend nations without violence. And so it seems odd, right, that someone who so clearly advocates abolishing the military would become the new face of American imperialism. There has been some research done that has said, I don't know if it's accurate, but I've read some documents that say that he's been funded by the CIA and the State Department through various nefarious organizations. So it's been said that he takes CIA money. It's been said that he takes State Department money, and he does so through its NGOs, the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute. Sorry, I'm just making sure my phone is off. That would be quite embarrassing for it to go off. And so I actually want to get away from that discussion, right? Like a bunch of radicals, leftists, including Noam Chomsky, signed a letter basically defending Gene Sharp. So maybe in 20 or 30 years we'll find out he was a CIA agent. I don't actually think he was, but that's not relevant here. What is relevant is what does he write, what does he advocate, and has the U.S. government taken it up as their form of political intervention, right? Are there any questions immediately about sort of the background of Gene Sharp and kind of why I want to move away from that into the actual thing he advocates? Okay, no questions. But again, please ask questions, comments, fiery denunciations at any time. So, the key book that he wrote is From Dictatorship to Democracy. And in fact, this has been translated into 30 different languages. It was in Tahrir Square in Egypt. It's been found in Syria. It's been found in all over Eastern Europe, et cetera, where he writes a very general, whether it be social groups, sports clubs, soccer teams, musical affiliations. Many are infiltrated and either directly or indirectly controlled by the state. And so he makes a big point that in some instances you can take over these state-run institutions, but in other instances, if you don't have an institution, like a student group, for example, then you should create one, right? And that would be a center of resistance. So we have the confidence, skills of the people, we have independent organizations. Then we must create a powerful resistance force. And so he talks about how resistance and political defiance needs to enter the very character of the population. And I'll talk a little bit about more about this, and it'll make more sense if it's not apparent, where he thinks power is derived from. But it needs to be widespread resistance. And again, we'll talk about this a little later, because every regime, regardless of what you characterize it, depends on all sorts of things, right? We need to make sure that the roads are in good condition, and there's a large infrastructure, so I can go to 7-Eleven and get Gatorade, right? Something as simple as that requires a wide number of people cooperating in a wide number of ways, and if there is widespread political, resistance, then it also, is able to shape the foundations of a society. Additionally, you'll notice, and this is a very conscious choice, is it needs to be a form of powerful internal resistance. And he makes this distinction. He actually is very skeptical of foreign intervention actually changing things, with some caveats that we'll talk about, especially when we're talking about how the American imperialists use this. But he doesn't believe that there are outside saviors. And he's actually very blunt about this, that if you depend on outside saviors, right, because these are dictatorships that the U.S. brings democracy to. He points out that, no, probably if someone is going to liberate you, they're not really going to liberate you. What they're really going to do is pursue their own political and economic interests. So he's actually very cognizant of, you know, that really no one cares about you outside your country. And if they do come in, they're not going to make things better. They're just doing it because they want something you have or for political reasons or what have you. Then, and we'll not talk about this so much, but there must be a grand strategic plan for liberation, and it must be implemented skillfully. Now, again, on the surface, he's writing for, you know, internal movements striving for democracy. So we don't really actually need to talk about this too much, because the grand strategic plan is actually U.S. imperialism, and I'll make that argument step by step. Also, if you have any questions, please shoot them to me as they come up, or comments, or relevant comments. You know, like, anyway, sorry, I've done online interviews or lectures before, and not all comments are created equally. So this is the core of political defiance, which he thinks is the root of nonviolent revolution. Now, he even talks about armed struggle, he talks about guerrilla war, and he, at least in his writing, is very skeptical of it, because, and his basic thesis is, well, the dictatorship has the military and the police, and you have nothing. So a guerrilla struggle is usually not the best form to carry out. Although he actually, later in the book, talks about how, in some cases, guerrilla struggle might make sense. He's, again, very pragmatic about it, very undogmatic about it, at least as far as in my assessment. But then he says, okay, so where does the authority of the dictatorship arise, right? If we want to get rid of a regime, and I'll actually start transitioning between regime and dictatorship, because it's not at all clear that how the U.S. uses it is against dictators, but in fact just regimes that they're unsympathetic to. So he starts listing where the political power of a dictatorship arises and how it can be addressed. Now, he has a very liberal conception of power, and I think a fairly accurate one, with some caveats. But again, he's very skillful and nuanced in it. His basic underlying premise is that all power of all regimes are ultimately derived from the people above those regimes. Right? It should sound very commonsensical, especially if you've been indoctrinated in American liberalism in high school and what have you. But then he goes further, and he says, well, in what way? You know, it's a great thing to say, oh, all governments are derived from their people. But that doesn't really tell us any useful information. So he actually creates a list of ways that a government is able to hold and wield political power, and what characteristics that takes. So the first he talks about is authority. Now, what do we mean by authority? And he says it's a belief. Authority is derived from a belief among the people that the regime is legitimate. Right? If people don't think it's a legitimate regime, they're more likely to resist it. And they also need to believe that they have a moral duty to obey it. Which is to say, right, and as revolutionaries run all the time, well, yeah, the U.S. government's really messed up, but if we fight it, then, you know, who's going to, you know, keep us safe from murderers, or, you know, various things. So, you know, it's really messed up, but it's a democracy, and those are the laws that were passed, and we just need to vote out bad politicians, right? That's a sense of authority that, I don't like the law, but so what does he consider human resources? It's the number and importance of the persons and groups which are obeying, cooperating, and providing assistance to the rulers. Now, this is very diverse. In fact, you can see in many regimes, especially in, say, Africa, some Asian regimes, less so in Latin America, or I'll use a positive example. Look at Bolivia, right? Part of the reason Evo Morales is able to maintain control of the regime is because there's not universal, but there's large, widespread indigenous support, right? So this would be one of the human resources that generally cooperate with Evo Morales where they wouldn't cooperate with other previous regimes that frequently would have done the same thing, right? If you think about our situation, you have widespread groups, including, for example, how do deportations get carried out? Well, there's a large group of primarily Euro-Americans who are willing to cooperate with deportations, whereas there are much fewer, right, Latino, Chicano, and Mexicanos who are willing to cooperate. But it's not just ethnic groups. That's one particular group, and many regimes derive their power from being part of the predominant ethnic group. Forms of tribalism, and I use that as pejorative, nationalism in Africa, where, you know, because it was colonized and the boundaries don't make any sense, right? One group is able to dominate another group because they are an ethnic group. There are also socioeconomic classes, right? By and large, in the United States, all of the upper class, in nearly all extents, are willing to cooperate with the American regime, right? Because it's in their interest. In a military dictatorship, the fact that the police and the military are willing to cooperate with the regime frequently allows them special perks. And so, like, for example, in Turkey, the military is intimately tied up to the ruling government because they receive so many benefits above and beyond, even, to a certain extent, even wealthy Turks who are not part of the ruling regime, right? So there's all sorts of different groups. You can think of economic groups, be those unions or different unions. Do the oil unions support the regime, but the railroad workers don't support the regime, and the teachers don't support the regime, but the police unions support the regime, right? So it's about understanding the human resources in groups. The next is skills and knowledge. Basically, the skills and knowledge needed by the regime to perform specific actions and supplied by cooperating persons or groups. If you think about it, let's look at Saudi Arabia and Dubai, right? For the most part, a lot of their oil exploration is done by Europeans and Americans. Why? Because they're such odious, oppressive regimes that in many respects, their people don't carry those out, or the people who do carry out oil exploration, engineering, et cetera, are handsomely rewarded by the regime, right? If you're in an oilocracy, right, you need to have the support of the people who work the oil platform, the people who drill the oil platform, the people who design the oil platform, et cetera, right? So there's special technical skills that every regime, depends on. Your air traffic controllers, your city planners, et cetera. And so as long as these special skills are in place, the regime can stay in place. When they're no longer in place, key functions of the regime begin to break down, and it varies from regime to regime, and what that regime is derived on. The next is intangible factors, which of course is a little more difficult. These are psychological and ideological factors that may induce people to obey and assist the rulers, right? I'll give a positive example, which is in Cuba, right? It's a very impoverished country. It's been suffering from a blockade for 60 years. It doesn't have a lot of natural resources, but ideologically, the Cuban people's firm commitment to revolutionary communism, right, and socialist democracy served to keep the regime legitimate during this special period, right? When the Soviet Union collapsed, they had to readjust their economy. So this would be a key, one of the ways in which people are ideologically unified around the regime. Various fascist regimes, whether it be Nazi Germany, Mussolini, Italy, Franco, Spain, the current government in Colombia, those fascist regimes maintain a lot of their legitimacy by having a shared ideology, whether it be, phalangelism, a national socialism, a messed up form of corporate capitalism in Colombia, like religious capitalism in Spain, or religious fascism in Spain, right? That served to bond people together. And as that ideological belief broke down, the legitimacy of the regime broke down, along with other factors. The next is material resources, right? If the regime is able to provide a very good standard of living, many people are willing to allow the absolute curtail of various freedoms. Now, again, the Gulf states, the oil Gulf states, are good examples of this. What they do is they provide a ridiculous amount of economic incentive to their citizens in order to keep them happy. They'll pay, if you get married, they'll give you 20 grand and a house, and you pay no taxes, and all sorts of benefits that you otherwise wouldn't get in most other regimes. That material abundance, right, keeps the regime stable. The flip side is, if you have universal widespread poverty, right, people no longer have material interest in maintaining the regime. A good example would be the Russian Revolution, right? What was claimed? Peace, land, and above all, bread, right? When the Russian czars were unable to feed their own people, the material reason to keep the czar around went out the window. So, and then finally, sanctions. And of course, sanctions, we mean not international sanctions at this point, but a way of saying you don't like what someone's doing. And this can include punishments, whether threatened or applied, against disobedient or the non-cooperative, to ensure submission and cooperation that are needed for the regime to exist and carry out its policies. So, what do we mean by this? Well, the fact that, let's use America as an example. If you criticize American foreign policy in Palestine, or you criticize American foreign policy in Colombia, what they'll do is they'll issue grand jury indictments and raid your house, raid your anti-war offices, harass you, just like they did to the anti-war 24. So the ability of the U.S. regime to carry out sanctions of people who disagree or are not cooperative is one of the ways it exercises that. In Saudi Arabia, it's the ability of the government to execute people, behead them, disappear them, torture them, etc. It's very easy to use Saudi Arabia because it's one of the most odious regimes on the face of the earth. And interestingly enough, right, Gene Sharp actually uses Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Qatar as actually dictatorships, like open dictatorships. So it's weird that this doesn't correspond directly to American foreign policy, which again makes it so much more bizarre that he really is the face of American imperialism. Yes.
So it can be a mixture of any of these, or one of these, or all of them?
Usually
all of these, or?
Usually it's all of these. But the thesis is, and it's a pretty legitimate thesis, very few regimes are able to satisfy all of these, right? If you have a regime that has impoverished people, like the United States, where what is it now, 10, 20% are at the poverty line or near the poverty line, it doesn't do a good job of material resources. But by imprisoning poor people, right, it's able to exercise sanctions really well. It also has intangible factors of American nationalism, authority by having the veneer of a democracy of the people, the government maintains legitimacy, which of course, as we've seen, especially with Occupy Wall Street and other movements, is eroding. Skills and knowledge. The computer programmers go into the NSA, the doctors, the lawyers, the best of the best are recruited into corporate America, which would be human resources, who have a vested interest, right? So there's always these divisions and contradictions among any given regime, where in some cases, one is the prevailing factor, the other is the prevailing factor. In Saudi Arabia, no one really believes in the intangible factors of the Saudi government, except for a very isolated group. No one actually believes in the religious theocracy. There's constantly reports about how princes and the royal family or rich people, will buy a couple of kilos of Coke and, a couple of handles of vodka, which is actually really frowned upon in Muslim society. It could lead to execution if you're an average Saudi. And then they'll have giant orgies for a week. And everybody knows this, right? So they have almost no material, intangible support. Whereas in, for example, the DPRK, right, North Korea, more colloquially, the people are actually won over to Marxism-Leninism. They actually ideologically believe in in the mission of the regime, even though there are very few material resources because they've been blockaded and shut out of the world economy, right? And so yes, any given regime could have any number of different factors, and again, and this will come later, they actually target the weakest point. And does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
I think somebody's trying to get in over there. Did I hear the word? Sorry, I may be losing. So let's talk about this just really quick on this point. So he actually has a big long list that I'm going to spare you from going through.
Stabilize the secular regime, and we'll talk a little bit more